some of the wildest, most jaw-dropping stories from Reddit that'll make you question everything you thought you knew about human behaviour. So smash that like button, hit subscribe, and comment below where you're watching from, because trust me, you won't believe what happens next. Let's jump right into the first story about a guy who discovered his entire life was built on a lie when he found a box in his parents' attic that he was never supposed to see. And what was inside changed everything forever. So this guy, let's call him Mike, was helping his parents clean out their attic before they moved to a smaller house, just doing the usual stuff like sorting through old Christmas decorations and boxes of childhood memories, when he stumbled upon a locked metal box hidden behind some insulation in the far corner. And at first he didn't think much of it, because everyone's parents have weird boxes of stuff they keep for no reason. But something about this one felt different. It felt deliberate, like it was meant to stay hidden. Mike asked his parents about it, and the look on their faces told him everything he needed to know. His mum went pale, and his dad immediately got defensive, asking why he was going through their things, which was weird because they literally asked him to help clean the attic. And that's when Mike knew he had to open that box no matter what. He waited until his parents went out for groceries and used a bolt cutter from the garage to break the lock. And inside he found documents, lots of documents, birth certificates, adoption papers, and photographs of people he'd never seen before. And that's when he realised the people he'd called Mom and Dad his entire life weren't his biological parents. But the crazy part wasn't even the adoption itself. It was what he found underneath all those papers. There were newspaper clippings about a kidnapping from 27 years ago, right around the time he was born, and the child in the grainy photograph looked exactly like him. Same birthmark on his left shoulder, same distinctive eye colour, and the parents in those news articles were desperately pleading for their son's return, offering a reward, anything to get their baby back. Mike's hands were shaking as he read through article after article, watching the story unfold over months and then years as the case went cold and the heartbroken parents eventually moved away, and he couldn't wrap his head around what this meant. Were his parents kidnappers? Were they involved in something darker than he could imagine? Or was this all some massive misunderstanding? When his parents came home, he confronted them with everything spread out on the kitchen table, and his mother broke down immediately, crying harder than he'd ever seen anyone cry, while his father just sat there with his head in his hands. And after what felt like hours, his dad finally started talking. He explained that Mike's biological parents were drug addicts who sold him for $10,000 when he was 6 months old. They couldn't have children of their own and were desperate. So when someone approached them at a bar with this offer, they convinced themselves they were saving a child from a horrible life. And the kidnapping story in the newspapers was fabricated by the biological parents to cover up what they'd done, because admitting you sold your baby wasn't something they wanted the world to know. Mike didn't know what to believe. His entire identity felt like it was crumbling, and he spent weeks going down every possible rabbit hole trying to verify the truth. He hired a private investigator. He tried to find his biological parents. He even considered going to the police, but every lead brought more questions than answers. And the worst part was knowing that no matter what the truth was, his life would never be the same. The private investigator eventually tracked down his biological mother, living in a trailer park 3 states away, still struggling with addiction. And when Mike finally met her, she barely remembered him. She claimed his father was the one who made the deal and that she tried to stop it, but was too high to do anything about it. And whether that was true or just another lie to make herself feel better, Mike would never really know. He decided not to pursue legal action, because what would be the point? The people who raised him loved him and gave him a good life, even if the circumstances of how he came into their lives were morally questionable at best, and his biological parents were clearly in no position to have raised a child. But that didn't make the betrayal hurt any less, and to this day he struggles with the question of whether he was saved or stolen. And honestly, maybe it's both. The wedding photographer who captured something no one was supposed to see. This next story is about a wedding photographer named Sarah, who was hired to shoot what seemed like a normal upscale wedding. Nothing too fancy, but definitely the kind where the families had money and everything needed to be perfect. And she'd done hundreds of weddings before, so she had her routine down. Show up early, get the details shots, capture the getting ready moments, then the ceremony and reception. Pretty standard stuff. But this wedding had a weird vibe from the start. The bride seemed nervous in a way that went beyond normal wedding day jitters. She kept checking her phone and looking over her shoulder like she was expecting something bad to happen. And the groom was almost too calm, like artificially calm. The kind of calm that comes from someone who's desperately trying to keep it together. Sarah did her job though. She captured beautiful shots of the venue, the flowers, the decorations, and when she was photographing the bride's dress hanging in the bridal suite, she noticed something odd in the reflection of the mirror. It looked like someone was standing in the doorway watching them, but when she turned around, nobody was there, and the bride's maid of honor just laughed it off, saying the venue was old and supposedly haunted. The ceremony started and everything seemed fine. The bride walked down the aisle. They exchanged vows and Sarah was getting some great shots. But then, during the part where the officiant asks if anyone objects to the marriage, someone actually stood up. And in all her years of shooting weddings, Sarah had never seen this happen in real life. It was a woman in her 50s, well dressed, and she didn't yell or make a scene. She just calmly said she needed to speak with the groom privately before the ceremony continued, and the groom's face went from calm to absolutely terrified in a split second, like he'd just seen a ghost. The woman walked up to the altar and whispered something in the groom's ear, and Sarah, being a professional, kept shooting because that's what you do. You document everything even when things go sideways, and she managed to capture the exact moment the groom's entire world fell apart. You could see it in his eyes. The groom asked for a 5-minute recess, which is apparently something you can do at weddings, and he, the mysterious woman, and both sets of parents disappeared into a back room while everyone else just stood there in confused silence. And Sarah took the opportunity to grab some shots of the guests' reactions, because honestly this was the most dramatic wedding she'd ever witnessed, and she knew these photos would be important somehow. 15 minutes passed, then 30, and people started getting restless. Some guests were leaving. The bride was crying in her maid of honour's arms, and Sarah just kept shooting because she didn't know what else to do. And then finally the groom emerged alone, walked up to the microphone, and announced that the wedding was off. Just like that, no explanation. And he walked out of the venue and drove away. Everyone was in shock. The bride collapsed, her family was furious, and Sarah was left wondering what the hell just happened. But she packed up her equipment and left because clearly her job there was done. Or so she thought. A few days later, the bride's mother called her, asking for all the photos. Even the ones from before the ceremony got called off, and she was willing to pay double Sarah's rate plus extra for the raw files, which was unusual, but Sarah agreed because money is money, and she felt bad for the bride. But then the groom called her, and this is where it gets really weird. He offered her $5,000 to delete every single photo from that day and sign an NDA. And when Sarah asked why, he said he couldn't explain, but it was a matter of life and death. And she thought he was being dramatic until she started going through the photos herself. In one of the shots she took during the ceremony, right before the woman stood up to object, you could see the woman in the background, and Sarah zoomed in on her face and did a reverse image search just out of curiosity, and what came up made her blood run cold. The woman was a federal agent who specialized in organized crime and witness protection, and suddenly everything made sense. Sarah realized she'd photographed something she wasn't supposed to see. The groom was clearly running from something or someone. Maybe witness protection, maybe something worse. And that woman showing up wasn't a coincidence, it was an intervention. And by capturing it all on camera, Sarah had created evidence of something that powerful people wanted to stay buried. She ended up deleting the photos and signing the NDA because honestly, what else could she do? She wasn't about to get involved in whatever mess this was, and she took the money and tried to forget the whole thing. But sometimes she wonders what really happened to that groom and whether the bride ever found out the truth. The craziest part is that a few months later she saw a news story about a major organised crime bust in another state, and in the background of one of the news photos being led away in handcuffs was someone who looked exactly like the groom. Different name, different life. And Sarah knew she'd been right to delete those photos and keep her mouth shut. The man who discovered his neighbour had been dead for 3 years. So this story is absolutely disturbing, and it comes from a guy named Tom who lived in a quiet suburban neighbourhood, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone and nothing exciting ever happens, or at least that's what he thought until he realised something was very wrong with the house next door. Tom had lived in his house for about 5 years, and his neighbour, an elderly man named Mr. Peterson, was always friendly but kept to himself. He'd wave from his window. Sometimes they'd chat about the weather when getting the mail, but nothing too deep. And over time Tom noticed he was seeing less and less of Mr. Peterson, but he figured the old man was just spending more time inside, or maybe his health was declining. What Tom didn't know was that Mr. Peterson had actually died 3 years ago, and the person he had been seeing in the window and occasionally talking to was Mr. Peterson's son, who had been living in the house and pretending his father was still alive. And the reason why is so disturbing that when Tom finally found out the truth, he couldn't sleep for weeks. It all started when Tom noticed a smell. Not a terrible smell at first, just kind of a musty odour that seemed to be coming from Mr. Peterson's house, and it got worse during the summer. And Tom mentioned it to some other neighbours, who said they'd noticed it too, but figured it was just an old horse with old house problems. Then one day Tom saw Mr. Peterson's son, who he'd met once or twice, loading boxes into a truck at 3 in the morning. And something about it felt off, like, why would you be moving stuff in the middle of the night unless you had something to hide? So Tom decided to do something he knew was nosy, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He called the non-emergency police line and said he was concerned about his elderly neighbour because he hadn't seen him in months and there was a strange smell coming from the house, and the police said they'd do a wellness check. And when they showed up and knocked on the door, Mr. Peterson's son answered and said everything was fine. His father was sleeping and didn't want to be disturbed, but the officers insisted on seeing Mr. Peterson, and that's when everything unravelled. The son kept making excuses, saying his father was sick, he was in the bathroom, he was hard of hearing, and probably wouldn't come to the door, but the officers weren't buying it, and eventually they forced their way in with probable cause, because the smell had gotten so bad that they suspected exactly what they ended up finding. Mr. Peterson's body was in his bedroom, in his bed, exactly where he died 3 years earlier, and his son had just been living in the house with his father's corpse, collecting his social security checks, paying the bills with his father's money, and pretending everything was normal. And the really disturbing part was that the son had been preserving the body with some kind of chemicals he'd bought online, not well enough to stop the smell, but enough that the body was still somewhat intact after 3 years. Tom found all this out because the police had to interview everyone on the street, and when he learned what had been happening literally 20 feet from his bedroom window, he felt sick. He'd been living next to a corpse for years and had no idea, and the worst part was wondering how many times he talked to the son while Mr. Peterson's body was just sitting there inside. The son was arrested, obviously, charged with concealing a death, fraud, abuse of a corpse, and a bunch of other things. And during the trial, it came out that he'd done this because he was broke and desperate. His father's social security was the only income keeping him afloat, and he convinced himself that what he was doing wasn't that bad because his father was already dead anyway, which is obviously insane logic, but that's what happens when people get desperate. The neighbourhood was never the same. After that, people started questioning what else might be happening behind closed doors, and Tom became obsessed with checking on his other neighbours, especially the elderly ones, because he never wanted to miss something like that again. He eventually moved to a different neighbourhood because he couldn't stand living in the house anymore, knowing what had been next door, and to this day he gets anxious whenever he smells anything musty or off, because it takes him right back to that moment when he realised he'd been living next to a 3-year-old corpse and had absolutely no idea. The teacher who found out her student was living a double life. This story comes from a high school teacher named Mrs. Anderson, who taught English at a pretty average suburban high school, and she had this student, let's call her Emma, who was one of those kids who seemed to have it all together. Straight A's, involved in clubs, always polite and well dressed, the kind of student teachers love because they make the job easy. But Mrs. Anderson started noticing some odd things about Emma, like she'd sometimes come to school with expensive designer bags and clothes that seemed way beyond what a typical high school student could afford, and other times she'd look exhausted, like she hadn't slept in days, and her mood would swing dramatically from week to week. At first, Mrs. Anderson thought maybe Emma's parents were going through a divorce, or there were problems at home. So she tried to gently ask if everything was okay, and Emma always said she was fine, just busy with school and extracurriculars, but something didn't add up. Then one day, Mrs. Anderson was at a restaurant in the city, about 30 miles from where she taught, and she saw Emma there. But Emma looked completely different. She was dressed like an adult, professional clothes, heels, makeup that made her look at least 25. And she was having dinner with a much older man, probably in his 50s, and they were talking and laughing like they were on a date. Mrs. Anderson's first instinct was that something bad was happening, that Emma was being groomed or exploited, so she kept watching, and she saw the man hand Emma an envelope, which she put in her purse, and then they left together, and Mrs. Anderson followed them outside and saw them get into a luxury car and drive away. She was freaking out, because this looked exactly like what you'd imagine a dangerous situation for a teenager would look like. So the next day she pulled Emma aside after class and very carefully asked if there was anything she needed to talk about, anything at all, and Emma's face went white, and Mrs. Anderson knew she'd been right to be concerned. Emma broke down and confessed everything, but it wasn't what Mrs. Anderson expected. Emma wasn't being trafficked or exploited in the traditional sense. She was running a sugar baby operation. She'd created fake profiles on multiple websites claiming to be in college, and she'd been dating wealthy older men for money, and she'd been doing it for almost 2 years. Mrs. Anderson was stunned. She didn't know what to say. On one hand, Emma was technically being exploited because she was a minor, but on the other hand, Emma had sought this out herself and seemed to think she was in control of the situation, and she was using the money to save for college because her parents had told her they couldn't afford to help her, and she refused to take on massive student loans. Emma begged Mrs. Anderson not to tell anyone. She said she was always safe. She never went to anyone's house, always met in public places, and she had rules about what she would and wouldn't do, and she truly believed she was just being smart and resourceful. But Mrs. Anderson knew this was way beyond inappropriate and potentially illegal. Mrs. Anderson was legally obligated to report this, so she went to the school counsellor, and they contacted CPS and the police, and Emma was furious. She felt betrayed, and said Mrs. Anderson had ruined her life, and in some ways, Mrs. Anderson worried that Emma was right, because once the investigation started, everything fell apart. Emma's parents were horrified and angry, not just at Emma but at each other for not noticing what was happening. Several of the men Emma had been seeing were arrested and charged with various crimes, and Emma had to testify in court, and the whole thing became this huge scandal that followed her for the rest of high school. Years later, Mrs. Anderson ran into Emma at a coffee shop. Emma was in her 20s now, had graduated from college and was working at a tech company. And she thanked Mrs. Anderson for what she did. She said at the time she hated her for it, but looking back, she realised how messed up that situation was and how it could have ended so much worse. And she was grateful that someone cared enough to intervene, even though she fought it every step of the way. Mrs. Anderson said it was one of the hardest things she'd ever had to do as a teacher because she knew Emma would hate her for it. But she also knew that protecting Emma was more important than being liked, and that's the kind of decision teachers have to make sometimes that people don't really think about. The whole experience changed how Mrs. Anderson looked at her students. She realised that you never really know what's going on in someone's life. Even the kids who seem to have everything figured out might be dealing with stuff that's way beyond what you'd imagine. And sometimes the best thing you can do is pay attention and care enough to get involved, even when it's uncomfortable. The guy who realised his best friend was stealing his identity. This story is wild, and it comes from a guy named Jason who had been best friends with someone, let's call him Marcus, since they were kids. They grew up on the same street, went to the same schools, were in each other's weddings, the whole deal. They were like brothers. But Jason started noticing weird things happening with his finances, credit cards he didn't apply for, accounts opened in his name, and his credit score tanking for no reason. And at first he thought he was a victim of some random identity theft, so he did all the usual stuff. Filed police reports, froze his credit, changed all his passwords. But the weird thing was that the identity theft kept happening even after he'd taken all these precautions, and it was like whoever was doing this had access to information that only someone really close to him would have. They knew his mother's maiden name, his first pet's name, all the security question answers, and Jason couldn't figure out how some random hacker would know all that. Then one day Jason got a call from a credit card company asking to verify some information, and when they read back the phone number associated with the account, it wasn't his number, it was Marcus's number. And that's when Jason's stomach dropped, because he realised his best friend had been stealing his identity for who knows how long. Jason didn't want to believe it, so he did some digging. He pulled his credit report and saw accounts going back almost 7 years, all with Marcus's contact information. And when he added up all the debt, it was over $150,000. And Jason had no idea how Marcus had racked up that much debt in his name, or what he'd spent the money on. He confronted Marcus about it, and Marcus completely denied it at first, said it must be a coincidence. Maybe someone else was using his phone number, but Jason wasn't stupid. He'd known Marcus his whole life, and he could tell when he was lying. So he pushed harder, and eventually Marcus broke down and admitted to everything. Turns out Marcus had a serious gambling addiction that he'd been hiding for years. He'd lost everything, his savings, his house, his marriage. And when he ran out of his own credit, he started using Jason's information to open new accounts, and he justified it by telling himself he'd pay it all back once he won big, which of course never happened, because that's not how gambling works. Jason was devastated, not even about the money, but about the betrayal. This this was someone he trusted more than almost anyone, someone he'd shared his whole life with. And Marcus had been systematically destroying Jason's financial future for years while pretending to be his friend. And the worst part was, Marcus seemed more upset about getting caught than about what he'd actually done. Jason pressed charges because what else could he do? He had a family to think about and his credit was ruined. And Marcus ended up pleading guilty to identity theft and fraud and got sentenced to 5 years in prison. And their friendship was obviously over, like there was no coming back from something like that. But even years later, Jason struggles with trust issues. He has a hard time getting close to people because in the back of his mind he's always wondering if they're using him for something. And he went through a really dark period where he questioned every friendship he'd ever had, wondering if anyone actually cared about him or if everyone was just pretending while secretly taking advantage of him. The financial recovery took years. Jason had to dispute every single fraudulent account, and even though technically he wasn't responsible for debt from identity theft, getting it all cleared from his record was a nightmare of paperwork and phone calls and bureaucracy, and his credit score didn't fully recover for almost a decade. He eventually got therapy to deal with the betrayal and the trust issues, and his therapist helped him understand that what Marcus did wasn't his fault. Some people are just broken in ways that make them hurt the people closest to them, and Jason had to learn to forgive himself for not seeing it sooner, even though there was really no way he could have known. These days, Jason is doing better. He's rebuilt his financial life, and he's learned to trust again, but he's also more careful about who he lets into his inner circle. And he says that while he doesn't wish Marcus any harm, he also has no interest in ever speaking to him again. And he hopes Marcus got the help he needs for his addiction, but that's not Jason's problem anymore. The whole experience taught Jason that you can know someone your entire life and still not really know them at all. People can hide massive problems and destructive behaviours even from the people closest to them. And sometimes the person you trust with your life is the exact person you shouldn't trust with anything. The woman who discovered her husband's secret family. This story absolutely destroyed me when I first read it. It's about a woman named Lisa who had been married to her husband David for 12 years. They had 2 kids together, lived in a nice house in the suburbs, and by all accounts seemed to have a solid marriage. Sure, they had their issues, like any couple, but nothing that seemed like a red flag for what was actually going on. David travelled a lot for work. He was in sales and would be gone sometimes for a week or 2 at a time, and Lisa was used to it. She'd built a whole life around being essentially a single parent during those periods, but she never questioned it because David was a good provider and he always came home and seemed happy to be with the family. Then one day Lisa got a Facebook message from a woman she'd never met, and the message said, "I think we need to talk about David." And Lisa's first thought was that this was some kind of scam, or that David had maybe had an affair, which would be awful but manageable. But when she agreed to meet this woman for coffee, the truth was so much worse than she could have imagined. The woman, let's call her Amanda, was also married to David, or at least she thought she was. They'd been together for 8 years, had a daughter together, and lived in a a city about 3 hours away, and David had been living a complete double life, splitting his time between two families, and neither woman had any idea the other existed. Lisa thought Amanda was lying or confused at first, but Amanda had photos, documents, even a marriage certificate. And when they compared notes, they realised David had been playing both of them. He'd tell Lisa he was travelling for work and then go stay with Amanda, and he'd tell Amanda he was travelling for work and come back to Lisa, and he'd been juggling this for almost a decade. The two women were in shock. They didn't know whether to be angry at each other, or at David, or at themselves for not seeing the signs, and they decided to team up and figure out the whole truth before confronting him. And what they discovered was even more disturbing. David wasn't just leading a double life with two families. He had a third woman in another state that he'd been involved with for about 3 years. No kids with that one, but he'd been promising her they'd get married soon, and all 3 women had been completely in the dark about each other. And when Lisa and Amanda started digging into the finances, they realised David had been running an elaborate scheme of credit cards and loans to fund this lifestyle, and he was actually deeply in debt, despite all 3 women thinking he was financially stable. They decided to all confront him together. They planned it out like a military operation. They figured out when David would be at Lisa's house, and Amanda and the third woman, let's call her Jessica, showed up unannounced, and the look on David's face when he opened the door and saw all 3 of them standing there was apparently something none of them will ever forget, like watching someone's entire world implode in real time. David tried to lie his way out of it at first, claimed Amanda and Jessica were crazy stalkers, but Lisa was done believing him. She'd seen too much evidence, and eventually David just shut down. He wouldn't talk, wouldn't explain, just sat there while the 3 women yelled at him and demanded answers. And when he finally spoke, all he said was, "I don't know why I did it," which was possibly the most unsatisfying explanation imaginable. All 3 women left him, obviously, and the legal fallout was insane. It turned out David was only legally married to Lisa. The marriage to Amanda wasn't valid because he was already married, so Amanda had no legal protections, despite thinking she'd been married for 8 years. And Jessica at least hadn't married him, but she loaned him money that she'd never get back. Lisa filed for divorce and went after everything, and she got most of the assets because David had literally committed bigamy, which isn't looked upon favourably in divorce court, and Amanda sued him for fraud and emotional distress, and Jessica just tried to move on with her life and chalk it up to a horrible mistake. The craziest part of this whole story is that apparently David had an entire system for keeping track of his lies. Lisa found a notebook in his car with details about each woman, their schedules, their kids' names, important dates. It was like he'd been running a project management system for his double life. And the amount of effort he'd put into maintaining this deception was honestly impressive in the most disturbing way possible. Lisa went through years of therapy trying to process the betrayal. She said the worst part wasn't even the other women. It was realizing that her entire marriage had been a performance. David had never really been present with her. He'd always been thinking about his other lives, and she missed out on the chance to have a real relationship because she'd been married to someone who was essentially 3 different people. These days, Lisa is doing better. She's remarried to someone who's boringly faithful, and she loves it, and she's been able to build a new life with her kids, but she says she'll never fully get over the mindfuck of discovering that her husband had been living multiple lives, and sometimes she still has moments where she questions whether anything in her life is real or if she's missing something obvious, and that's the kind of psychological damage that doesn't just go away. Amanda also eventually moved on, but she struggled more because she had no legal recourse for the years she spent thinking she was married, and the emotional toll of explaining to her daughter that her father was never who they thought he was. That was something that affected both of them deeply. As for David, last anyone heard, he'd moved to another state and was apparently dating someone new, and all 3 women live in fear that some other woman is going to get pulled into his web of lies. But they've done what they can by reporting him and making sure there's a public record of what he did, and they hope that's enough to prevent him from doing it again. But honestly, they know it probably won't be, because people like David don't change. They just get better at hiding. The landlord who found out what his tenant was really doing. This story comes from a landlord named Rick, who owned a few rental properties as investments, and he had this one tenant in a small house on the edge of town, a quiet guy in his 30s named Brian, who worked from home and kept to himself, paid rent on time every month, never complained, basically the ideal tenant from a landlord's perspective. Brian had been living there for about 3 years, and Rick had only met him in person maybe twice, once when he moved in, and once when Rick had to fix a plumbing issue, and both times Brian seemed normal, maybe a little awkward, but nothing that set off any alarms. Then Rick started getting noise complaints from the neighbours. They said they were hearing weird sounds coming from the house at night, like machinery running and occasional banging. And one neighbour said they saw Brian carrying large bags into the house at odd hours, and Rick figured maybe Brian was doing some kind of home business that was getting a bit out of hand, so he decided to do an inspection, which he was legally allowed to do with proper notice. Rick sent Brian an email letting him know he'd be stopping by in 3 days to check on the property, and Brian responded almost immediately, asking if they could reschedule. He said he had a work deadline and the house was a mess. But Rick insisted because the noise complaints were getting more frequent, and he needed to make sure there wasn't any damage to the property. When Rick showed up, Brian answered the door, but wouldn't let him in at first. He stood in the doorway blocking the entrance and kept saying everything was fine, but Rick could hear machinery running inside, and there was a weird chemical smell, and he told Brian he was coming in whether Brian liked it or not, because it was his property, and he had given proper notice. What Rick found inside was absolutely insane. Brian had turned the entire house into a cryptocurrency mining operation. There were hundreds of computer servers set up in every room, industrial fans running constantly, and the electricity bills must have been astronomical. And Rick later found out Brian had been tampering with the electric meter to hide how much power he was actually using, which was not only stealing, but also incredibly dangerous because the house's electrical system was never designed to handle that kind of load. But that wasn't even the worst part. When Rick went into the basement, he found that Brian had been manufacturing fake IDs and documents. There were printers, laminators, and stacks of fake driver's licenses, passports, and social security cards. And Rick realized his tenant was running a full-scale identity fraud operation out of his rental property. And if the cops raided the place, Rick's property could be seized as part of the criminal investigation. Rick immediately told Brian he needed to leave, like immediately, and Brian tried to negotiate, offered to pay Rick a huge amount of money to keep quiet and let him finish up his current projects. But Rick wasn't about to become an accessory to whatever crimes Brian was committing, so he called the police right there from the property, and Brian made a run for it out the back door, but the cops caught him a few blocks away. The aftermath was a nightmare for Rick. The police seized a bunch of equipment as evidence. The house needed thousands of dollars in repairs because Brian had damaged the electrical system, and there were holes drilled through walls for cables, and Rick had to hire a lawyer to make sure he wouldn't be held liable for Brian's crimes. And the whole process took months to resolve. Rick found out during the investigation that Brian was part of a larger criminal network. The cryptocurrency mining was funding other operations, and the fake IDs were being sold on the dark web, and Brian had chosen to rent a house instead of buying one because it made it harder to trace the operation back to him. And landlords like Rick typically don't do thorough inspections as long as rent is paid, so it was the perfect cover. The prosecutor assured Rick that he wasn't in any legal trouble because he had no way of knowing what Brian was doing, but it was still incredibly stressful. And Rick became paranoid about his other rental properties. He started doing more frequent inspections and running more thorough background checks on potential tenants, and even installed security cameras outside his properties so he could monitor who was coming and going. Brian ended up pleading guilty to a bunch of federal charges and got sentenced to over 10 years in prison, and Rick had to testify at the sentencing hearing about the damage to his property. And seeing Brian in court, this guy who had seemed so normal and quiet, it really messed with Rick's head because he realized how easy it is for people to hide who they really are. These days, Rick is much more cautious about who he rents to, maybe overly cautious, and he knows some people probably think he's being paranoid, but after what happened with Brian, he doesn't care. He'd rather be overly careful than end up with another situation like that. The whole experience taught Rick that paying rent on time doesn't mean someone is a good tenant, and being quiet doesn't mean someone isn't causing problems. It might just mean they're good at hiding what they're really doing, and now Rick trusts his instincts more. If something feels off, he investigates immediately instead of assuming everything is fine just because he hasn't seen any obvious red flags. The office worker who realized her boss was running a cult. So this story is genuinely disturbing, and it's about a woman named Jennifer who got a job at what seemed like a normal marketing company. It was a small firm, maybe 20 employees, and during the interview process, everything seemed professional and above board. They talked about client work and marketing strategies and normal business stuff. But Jennifer started noticing weird things things pretty much immediately. After she started, first of all, the office culture was intense in a way that felt off. People worked crazy hours, not because they had to, but because they seemed to genuinely believe that working less would be letting down the team, and everyone was super close in this almost artificial way, like they'd all been programmed to be best friends. The boss, let's call him Richard, was this charismatic guy in his 40s who had this way of making everyone feel like they were part of something special. He'd give these motivational speeches about how they weren't just a company, but a family. And he'd talk about personal growth and reaching your potential. And at first Jennifer thought it was just typical corporate cheerleading, annoying but harmless. Then Richard started hosting mandatory weekend retreats at his property outside the city. He called them team building exercises, and employees were expected to attend, and if you couldn't make it, you had to have a really good excuse. And Jennifer went to her first one, and it was weird. They did normal team building stuff during the day, but then at night they'd sit around a fire, and Richard would lead these sessions that were basically group therapy combined with weird quasi-spiritual stuff about unlocking your inner power and letting go of toxic influences in your life. Jennifer noticed that Richard had this way of subtly manipulating people during these sessions. He'd ask probing personal questions and then use the information to make people feel vulnerable and dependent on the group for support. And anyone who pushed back or questioned the process was labelled as resistant to growth or not committed to the team, and the social pressure to conform was intense. Over the next few months, things escalated. Richard started encouraging employees to cut ties with friends and family members who didn't support their work at the company. He'd say things like, if someone doesn't understand your dedication, then they're holding you back. And Jennifer watched as several co-workers gradually isolated themselves from their outside support systems and became completely dependent on Richard and the company for their social and emotional needs. There were also financial red flags. Richard had convinced several employees to invest their savings into the company with promises of huge returns, and he'd position it as a test of loyalty and belief in the mission, and people were putting in tens of thousands of dollars based on nothing but Richard's charisma and vague promises about future success. Jennifer started doing some digging and found out that the company wasn't nearly as successful as Richard claimed. They had very few actual clients, and most of the revenue seemed to be coming from these employee investments and from services they sold to each other. Like Richard had created this closed loop economy where employees were basically funding their own salaries by buying coaching sessions and seminars from Richard and other senior staff. She also discovered that Richard had done this before. He'd run 2 other companies that had collapsed under similar circumstances, and there were former employees online describing experiences that sounded exactly like what Jennifer was going through, using words like cult and manipulation and financial exploitation. Jennifer tried to talk to some of her co-workers about her concerns, but they were so deep in Richard's influence that they reported her to him for spreading negativity, and Richard called her into his office and did this thing where he acted really concerned and caring, asking what was troubling her and whether she was dealing with with personal issues that were affecting her judgment, and he offered to give her extra coaching sessions to help her work through her resistance. And the whole interaction was designed to make her feel like she was the problem. That's when Jennifer decided she needed to get out, but she realised that leaving wouldn't be enough because Richard was genuinely hurting people and destroying their finances and relationships. So she started documenting everything. She kept copies of financial documents, recorded some of the weekend retreat sessions on her phone, and reached out to former employees who had escaped and were willing to talk about their experiences. Jennifer ended up quitting and filing complaints with the Labour Board and the FTC about the company's practices, and she shared all her documentation with a local journalist who was interested in doing a story about corporate cult-like environments. And when the article came out, it was devastating for Richard's operation. It detailed everything from the financial schemes to the psychological manipulation tactics, and it included interviews with multiple former employees who had similar stories. The fallout was significant. Several employees left immediately after the article was published. Some of them were angry at Jennifer for exposing it, because they still believed in Richard and thought she was just a disgruntled former employee spreading lies. But others reached out to thank her because the article had opened their eyes to what was really happening, and they'd been looking for permission to leave. Richard tried to do damage control. He sent out a company-wide email calling the article fake news and a hit piece by people who couldn't handle the company's high standards, and he framed Jennifer as someone who had failed and was now trying to tear down what they'd built together. But it didn't work because too many people had started questioning things, and once you start questioning a cult-like system, the whole thing tends to fall apart pretty quickly. The company eventually shut down after multiple lawsuits from former employees trying to get their investments back, and Richard moved to another state, and from what Jennifer heard, he was trying to start the whole thing over again with a new company and new victims. And that's the thing about people like Richard. They don't stop because they genuinely believe their own bullshit. They think they're visionaries, and that anyone who doesn't see it is just too weak or close-minded to understand. Jennifer had to go through therapy to process the experience because even though she'd gotten out relatively early, the psychological impact of being in that environment was real. She'd started doubting her own perceptions and judgment, and she had to relearn how to trust herself and recognize manipulation tactics, so she'd never fall for something like that again. She now works at a normal company with normal problems, and she says she'll never take for granted how valuable it is to have a boss who just wants you to do your job and go home. No grand mission, no family metaphors, just a straightforward employment relationship. And she's become really vocal about warning people about corporate environments that show cult-like characteristics, because she doesn't want anyone else to go through what she went through. The experience taught Jennifer that cults don't just exist in compounds in the desert. They can happen anywhere that someone charismatic is allowed to have unchecked power over vulnerable people. And corporate environments are perfect for this because people need their jobs and are already primed to defend defer to authority. And if you add in some pseudo-spiritual language about purpose and belonging, you can create a system where people willingly exploit themselves and call it personal growth. The guy who found out his girlfriend was catfishing him with her own photos. This story is bizarre, and it comes from a guy named Alex who met a girl on a dating app, let's call her Sarah, and they hit it off immediately. Great conversations, similar interests, and Sarah was gorgeous in her photos, like legitimately beautiful, and Alex felt like he'd won the lottery. They texted constantly for about 2 weeks before meeting up, and Sarah kept making excuses about why she couldn't video chat. Her camera was broken, she was insecure about how she looked on video, she preferred to meet in person, and Alex thought it was a little odd, but not a huge red flag, because some people genuinely are camera shy. When they finally met up for their first date, Alex was confused, because Sarah looked like her photos but also didn't. It's hard to explain, but something was off, like all the features were the same, but the overall impression was different, and Alex couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. And he felt bad for even thinking about it, because Sarah was right there being charming and funny, and everything he'd hoped for. They dated for about 3 months and it was great. Sarah was amazing, but Alex couldn't shake this nagging feeling that something wasn't adding up. And then, one day, he was scrolling through Instagram and came across a profile of someone who looked exactly like Sarah's photos, like exactly same poses, same backgrounds, same everything. And the account belonged to someone with a completely different name. Alex's heart sank, because he thought Sarah had been using someone else's photos to catfish him. But when he looked closer, he realised the person in the Instagram account and Sarah were clearly the same person, just the Instagram photos were heavily edited, like professional level Facetune and filters, to the point where this person had created essentially a different version of themselves. Alex confronted Sarah about it and she broke down crying. She admitted that all her dating app photos were heavily edited versions of herself. She'd spent hours perfecting them because she was insecure about her appearance, and she knew that heavily edited photos got way more matches, and she'd planned to only meet up with people she really connected with, hoping that by that point they'd like her personality enough that the difference between the photos and reality wouldn't matter. Alex didn't know how to feel. On one hand, he understood insecurity and the pressure to look perfect on social media. On the other hand, he felt deceived because the photos Sarah had used were edited to the point of being misleading. Like, if someone showed him the edited photo and the real Sarah side by side, he'd have a hard time believing they were the same person. And the whole relationship now felt like it had been built on a deception, even though Sarah, the person, was the same one he'd been dating all along. Sarah explained that she'd been bullied about her appearance growing up, and social media had made her insecurity worse because she was constantly comparing herself to edited and filtered versions of other people, and she'd learned how to edit her own photos to create the version of herself she wished she looked like. And at first it was just for fun, but then she started using those photos on dating apps and getting way more attention than she ever had with unedited photos, and it became addictive, like she'd created this alternate version of herself that was more successful at dating than the real her. messed up part was that Sarah was objectively attractive in real life. She didn't need the heavy editing, but her self-image was so distorted that she genuinely believed no one would be interested in her real appearance, and she'd basically been catfishing people with her own photos, which is such a weird and sad thing that Alex didn't even know it was possible until it happened to him. Alex struggled with whether to continue the relationship. He really liked Sarah, but the trust had been broken, and every time he looked at her, he thought about the edited photos and wondered what else she might be lying about, and Sarah was so apologetic and promised to never use edited photos again. But Alex couldn't get past the feeling that if she'd lie about something so fundamental as what she looked like, then what else might she lie about? They tried to work through it with couples therapy, even though they'd only been dating a few months, and the therapist helped Sarah understand that what she'd done was a form of catfishing, even though she was using her own photos because she was presenting a false version of herself, and she needed to work on her self-image issues before she could have a healthy relationship with anyone. Alex ultimately decided to end the relationship because he couldn't rebuild the trust, and he felt terrible about it because he knew Sarah was dealing with real psychological issues around her self-image, but he also knew he couldn't be in a relationship where he was constantly wondering what was real and what was performance. Sarah apparently got help for her body dysmorphia and started using unedited photos on her social media and dating profiles. And Alex heard through mutual friends that she was doing better and had started dating someone new who knew from the start what she really looked like. And Alex was happy for her, but also still kind of messed up about the whole experience. The whole thing made Alex hyper aware of photo editing on dating apps. He started being suspicious of anyone whose photos looked too perfect or too heavily filtered, and he'd asked to video chat before meeting up just to make sure the person looked roughly like their photos. And his friends made fun of him for being paranoid, but he didn't care because he never wanted to be in that situation again. What really stuck with Alex was the realization of how much damage social media and photo editing apps have done to people's self-image, especially women, creating this impossible standard where even beautiful people feel like they're not good enough unless they've digitally altered themselves. And the fact that Sarah had been catfishing herself, that she created a version of herself she thought was more lovable, and then had to maintain that deception. It was just really sad, and made Alex think about how many people might be doing the same thing without even realizing how harmful it is. The paramedic who responded to an emergency at his own house. This story is heartbreaking, and it comes from a paramedic named Mike, who had been working in emergency medical services for about 8 years. He'd seen pretty much everything and had developed that dark sense of humour and emotional detachment that first responders need to survive in that job. Mike worked 24-hour shifts and would be away from home for long periods, and he lived with his wife and their 2 young kids in a small town where everyone knew everyone. One day Mike was on shift and they got a call for a paediatric emergency at an address, and Mike didn't immediately recognise the address because in the moment you're focused on the medical information. The dispatcher said it was a possible drowning, child unresponsive, CPR in progress, and Mike and his partner rushed to the scene with lights and sirens going. When they pulled up to the house, Mike's entire world stopped because he recognized the house. It was his house, and he saw his wife outside screaming and holding their 4-year-old daughter who wasn't moving. And Mike went into this weird autopilot mode where his training took over, but part of his brain was completely shutting down because this was his daughter, his baby, and he wasn't supposed to be the one doing this. Mike and his partner started working on his daughter. She'd been playing in the backyard and had somehow gotten into their pool despite the fence they had around it. And his wife had found her floating face down and had pulled her out and started CPR, but she'd been under for an unknown amount of time. And Mike was doing chest compressions on his own. Daughter trying to stay professional and detached, but inside he was completely falling apart. They got his daughter into the ambulance, and Mike's partner told him he should ride in the back with the other crew while he drove, because Mike was too emotionally involved to make clear medical decisions. But Mike refused. He needed to be the one working on her, because if something went wrong, and he hadn't done everything possible, he'd never forgive himself. So they let him stay on as part of the medical team, even though it broke every protocol. The whole way to the hospital, Mike was doing CPR and bagging her and running through the ACLS algorithms. He'd done 1,000 times on strangers, and he was talking to her, telling her to stay with him, and that Daddy was here, and she was going to be okay. And his partner later said it was the most heartbreaking thing he'd ever witnessed in his career, watching Mike try to save his own daughter while tears were streaming down his face, but his hands were steady and professional, because that's what years of training does to you. They got to the hospital, and the ER team took over and physically pulled Mike out of the room because he wasn't allowed to be involved in his own daughter's care. And Mike collapsed in the hallway while his wife showed up with their son, and they held each other waiting for news, and Mike said those were the longest minutes of his entire life, longer than any emergency call he'd ever been on, because this time it wasn't a stranger, it was his whole world. The doctors managed to get his daughter's heart started again, and she was put on life support, and over the next few days Mike and his wife basically lived at the hospital while their daughter fought to recover, and Mike blamed himself for everything. He should have installed a better lock on the pool gate. He should have been home instead of at work. He should have taught her better about pool safety, even though she was only 4, and his wife kept telling him it wasn't his fault. But Mike couldn't hear it. Their daughter eventually woke up and recovered. She had some memory issues and needed therapy for a while, but she survived with no major lasting damage. And Mike says it was a literal miracle, because he's seen drowning cases and he knows how bad the outcomes usually are, especially when you don't know how long someone was under. And the fact that his daughter survived relatively intact defied all the statistics, but the emotional aftermath for Mike was devastating. He developed PTSD from the incident. He couldn't go on pediatric calls anymore without having panic attacks, and he'd have nightmares about performing CPR on his daughter, and this time failing to save her, and he eventually had to take a leave of absence from work because he just couldn't function as a paramedic anymore. Mike went through intensive therapy and was diagnosed with secondary traumatic stress, which is different from regular PTSD because it comes from responding to an emergency involving someone you love. And his therapist told him that what he experienced was one of the most traumatic scenarios a first responder can face, responding to an emergency at your own home with your own family, because it shatters the psychological barrier you've built between your professional life and personal life. Mike tried to go back to work after several months, but he just couldn't do it. Every call felt like it could be his family again, and he'd freeze up or make mistakes because he was too emotionally involved in every single patient, and he realized he couldn't be an effective paramedic anymore, so he ended up leaving the field entirely and getting a job doing medical billing, which was stable and boring and exactly what he needed. The whole experience changed Mike's entire perspective on life. He became obsessive about safety. They installed multiple layers of protection around the pool and eventually just filled it in completely because Mike couldn't stand looking at it. And he developed this hypervigilance about his kids, where he needed to know where they were and what they were doing at all times, and his wife had to help him find a balance between being protective and being controlling. Mike says the worst part wasn't even the emergency itself. It was the months afterward of dealing with the trauma and the guilt and the what-ifs, and he'd have these moments where he'd watch his daughter playing and be overcome with gratitude that she was alive, but also terror about all the things that could still go wrong, and learning to live with that anxiety was harder than any emergency call he'd ever been on. These days, Mike is doing better. His daughter is a healthy teenager now and doesn't remember the incident at all, which Mike is grateful for, and he's learned to manage his anxiety through therapy and medication. But he says he'll never fully get over the experience of having to perform CPR on his own child. It's something that stays with you forever, and he has enormous respect for any first responder who's been through something similar, because it's a kind of trauma that people don't really understand unless they've lived it. The adoptive parents who found out their child's birth mother never gave her up. This story is legally and morally complicated, and it's about a couple, let's call them Tom and Lisa, who struggled with infertility for years and eventually decided to adopt, and they went through a private adoption agency and were matched with a birth mother who was young and said she wasn't ready to be a parent and wanted to give her baby a better life. All the usual stuff you hear in adoption stories. The adoption seemed to go smoothly. The birth mother signed all the paperwork. Tom and Lisa brought their baby daughter home and spent the next 3 years building their family and falling completely in love with this little girl who they considered their daughter in every way that mattered. Then one day there was a knock on their door, and it was the police with a woman they'd never seen before, and the woman was crying and saying that she was their daughter's birth mother. And Tom and Lisa were confused because they thought the birth mother had signed away her rights and wanted nothing to do with the child, but this woman was insisting she never gave up her baby and had been searching for her for 3 years. Turns out the adoption agency had been running a scam. They'd been taking babies from vulnerable customers under false pretenses, telling them they were signing papers for temporary foster care or financial assistance, when actually they were signing adoption papers. And in some cases, they were literally stealing babies from hospitals and forging documents. And Tom and Lisa's daughter was one of dozens of children who'd been illegally adopted through this agency. Tom and Lisa were devastated because their entire world was falling apart. The daughter they'd raised for 3 years might not legally be theirs. And there was this other woman who had an equal, if not greater, claim to the child, and the legal battle that followed was absolutely brutal for everyone involved. The birth mother, whose name was Maria, had been 17 when she gave birth. She'd gone to what she thought was a social services office for help with getting baby supplies, and they'd manipulated her into signing documents she didn't understand. And when she came back to pick up her baby, they told her the child had been placed with a family and she had no rights, and Maria had been too young and scared to know how to fight back at the time. Maria had spent the next 3 years trying to find her daughter. She'd reported it to police, but they initially didn't believe her story. She'd hired lawyers who told her it was hopeless, and she'd finally connected with an investigative journalist who was exposing the adoption agency's practices. And that's how she found Tom and Lisa. The legal system didn't know what to do because technically Tom and Lisa had done nothing wrong. They'd gone through what they thought was a legitimate adoption process and had no way of knowing the agency was corrupt, but Maria's parental rights had never been legally terminated, so technically she was still the mother. And meanwhile, there's this 3-year-old girl who only knows Tom and Lisa as her parents and has no memory of Maria. The case went to court, and it was heartbreaking for everyone. Maria was fighting for her daughter back, and you couldn't blame her. Tom and Lisa were fighting to keep the daughter they'd raised, and you couldn't blame them either. And the little girl was caught in the middle of this nightmare, not understanding why all the adults in her life were so upset, and why this stranger kept showing up and crying when she saw her. The judge ordered a gradual transition plan where Maria would start having supervised visits with her daughter to build a relationship, and depending on how that went, they'd determine custody, and Tom and Lisa were told they might lose their daughter entirely or might end up with some kind of shared custody arrangement. And the uncertainty was torture for everyone. Over the next year, Maria had regular visits with her daughter, and the little girl started calling her Maria, and then eventually started understanding that Maria was her birth mother. And it was confusing for her, but kids are resilient, and she adapted, and something unexpected happened. Tom and Lisa and Maria actually started communicating and realized they all wanted what was best for the child, and they came to an agreement outside of court. They decided on a shared custody arrangement where the little girl would live primarily with Tom and Lisa, since they were the only parents she'd ever known. But Maria would have regular visitation and would be involved in major decisions. And as the girl got older, she'd have more say in how much time she spent with each family. And everyone agreed to go to family therapy to help navigate this weird, blended family situation. It wasn't perfect, and there were definitely difficult moments. Holidays were complicated. The little girl sometimes got confused about where she belonged. And Tom and Lisa had to deal with the grief of knowing they weren't the only parents anymore. But they made it work, because the alternative was putting a child through a traumatic custody battle that would damage her no matter who won. The adoption agency was eventually shut down, and the people running it were prosecuted. And there were dozens of other families in similar situations, trying to figure out what to do. Some chose to fight to keep the children. Others worked out arrangements like Tom and Lisa did. And a few actually decided to give the children back to their birth mothers entirely. And there was no right answer because every situation was different, and everyone involved was a victim of the agency's fraud. Tom and Lisa say it was the hardest thing they've ever been through. They'd gone into adoption thinking they were giving a child a loving home, and instead they'd unknowingly participated in basically kidnapping, even though it wasn't their fault. It was hard not to feel guilty, and they had to process a lot of complicated emotions about what it means to be a parent and whether love and biology are equal claims to a child. Maria also struggled because she got her daughter back in some sense, but not in the way she'd hoped. She had to share her child with the people who'd been raising her, and she missed out on the first 3 years of her daughter's life and could never get that back, and she had to watch her daughter call someone else mom and know that in many ways Tom and Lisa would always be more of a parent than she was, and that was a grief that never fully went away. The little girl, who's older now, apparently has adjusted well considering everything. She has 2 families who love her, and she's learned to navigate between them. And Tom and Lisa and Maria all agree that they did the best they could in an impossible situation, and they hope that as she gets older, she'll understand that all the adults in her life were trying to do right by her, even when that meant making painful compromises. The whole situation raises questions about adoption practices and how vulnerable mothers are protected, and whether agencies have too much power and too little oversight. And Tom and Lisa became advocates for adoption reform because they never want another family to go through what they went through. And Maria speaks at events about coercion in adoption and how young mothers need better protection and support so they don't get taken advantage of by predatory agencies. The final story. The college student who discovered she was living next to a fugitive. Alright, this last story is going to blow your mind, and it's about a college student named Emma who was renting a cheap apartment near campus. The kind of place with thin walls and questionable plumbing, but it's all you can afford on a student budget. Emma's next door neighbour was a middle-aged woman who kept to herself, always polite when they ran into each other in the hallway, but never chatty, and Emma appreciated having a quiet neighbour because she'd heard horror stories about loud parties and fighting couples, so she considered herself lucky. The woman, who went by the name Patricia, had lived there for about 5 years, according to the landlord, paid rent on time, never caused problems, just a completely unremarkable tenant, and Emma didn't think twice about her for the first few months of living there. Then one night Emma was studying late, and she heard raised voices through the wall. It sounded like Patricia was arguing with someone, and Emma tried to ignore it because it wasn't really her business. But then she heard what sounded like things breaking, and Patricia screaming, and Emma got worried and called the police for a wellness check. The police showed up and knocked on Patricia's door, and Emma watched through her peephole as Patricia answered, looking completely normal. She told the officers everything was fine. She'd just dropped some dishes and had been cursing at herself for being clumsy. And the officer looked around briefly and left, and Patricia smiled and waved at Emma afterward, like nothing had happened, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Emma started paying more attention after that, and she noticed weird patterns. Patricia would get deliveries at odd hours, always with different delivery people who seemed nervous, and she'd bring in boxes quickly and close the door immediately. And sometimes Emma would hear multiple voices from Patricia's apartment, even though she supposedly lived alone. Emma felt like she was going crazy because everything could have an innocent explanation. Maybe Patricia worked night shifts, and that's why her schedule was weird. Maybe the voices were from a TV. Maybe Emma was just being paranoid and watching too many true crime documentaries. Then, one day, Emma was at the campus library using the computers for research, and she stumbled upon a website about fugitives and cold cases. She wasn't even looking for it. She'd clicked the wrong link, and she was scrolling through, out of boredom, when she saw a photo that made her heart stop. It was Patricia, or at least it looked exactly like her, but the name was different, and the photo was from a wanted poster from 15 years ago. According to the website, Patricia, whose real name was supposedly Diane Winters, had fled across state lines after being accused of embezzlement and fraud. She'd stolen over $2 million from the company where she worked as CFO and had disappeared before she could be arrested, and there was a reward for information leading to her arrest. Emma didn't know what to do. On one hand, this could be a huge misunderstanding. Maybe it was just someone who looked like Patricia. On the other hand, what if it really was her, and Emma was living next door to a fugitive? And Emma spent days agonizing over whether to report it, because what if she was wrong and she ruined some innocent woman's life? Emma eventually decided she had to at least call the tip line anonymously. She figured if it wasn't really Diane, then the investigation would clear Patricia and no harm done. And if it was Diane, then she needed to face justice for what she'd done. So Emma called and gave them Patricia's address and description and left it at that. A week later, Emma was coming home from class, and there were FBI agents everywhere. They were in the hallway outside Patricia's apartment, and they were bringing out boxes of evidence, and Patricia was being led out in handcuffs, and when she saw Emma, she gave her this look that was part betrayal and part resignation, like she'd always known this day would come, and she was almost relieved it was finally over. Emma found out later that Patricia was indeed Diane Winters. She'd been living under a fake identity for 15 years. The embezzled money had been hidden in offshore accounts, and she'd been slowly funneling small amounts to fund her life in hiding. And the FBI had been looking for her all this time, but she'd done such a good job of disappearing that they'd almost given up. Diane had created an entire fake history. She had forged documents, a fake social security number, and she'd been working cash jobs and keeping a low profile. And the only reason Emma recognized her was because Diane had aged and looked different enough that she thought she was safe. But the bone structure and distinctive features were still the same. Emma felt weird about the whole thing. On one hand, she'd helped catch a criminal, and there was even a reward, which helped pay for her textbooks that semester. On the other hand, Patricia had been a perfectly good neighbour, and Emma felt like she'd betrayed her, even though rationally she knew she'd done the right thing, and it was hard to reconcile the friendly woman next door with the image of someone who'd stolen millions of dollars. During the trial, Emma learned more about Diane's backstory. She'd embezzled the money because her husband had massive gambling debts and they were about to lose everything, and she convinced herself she was just borrowing it and would pay it back. But once she started, she couldn't stop, and it spiraled out of control, and when the company started auditing her, she panicked and ran instead of facing the consequences. Diane ended up pleading guilty and got sentenced to 12 years in prison, and she had to pay back the money she'd stolen plus interest and penalties, and Emma attended one day of the trial, and Diane actually made eye contact with her and mouthed, "Thank you," which Emma didn't understand at first, but later Diane's lawyer explained that Diane had been living in constant fear for 15 years, always looking over her shoulder, never able to form real relationships or live a normal life, and in some ways being caught was a relief because she could finally stop running. Emma moved out of that apartment at the end of the semester because living there reminded her too much of the whole situation, and she had nightmares about what could have happened if Diane had been more dangerous, like what if she'd been violent instead of just a white-collar criminal? What if she'd tried to hurt Emma to protect her secret? And Emma realised how vulnerable she'd been living next to someone who had so much to lose if their identity was discovered. The whole experience made Emma much more cautious about who she lived near, and she started doing background checks on neighbours, which her friend said was paranoid, but Emma didn't care. She learned that people can hide enormous secrets, and you really have no idea who you're living next to. And while most people are exactly who they seem to be, sometimes you end up living 20 feet away from a fugitive who's been on the run for over a decade, and you have no clue until you accidentally stumble upon their wanted poster online. Emma sometimes wonders what happened to Diane after prison, whether she managed to rebuild her life, or whether being caught destroyed whatever was left of it. And she feels this weird mix of guilt and satisfaction. Guilt because she was the one who ended Diane's freedom, but satisfaction because justice was served, and the people Diane stole from got at least some of their money back, and Emma has learned to live with that moral ambiguity because real life isn't as clear-cut as we'd like it to be, and sometimes doing the right thing doesn't feel good even when you know it was necessary. And that's where we'll end today's video. These stories show us that life is stranger and more complicated than fiction, and the people around us might be hiding secrets we can't even imagine. So, before you go, make sure you've hit that like button and subscribed, because I post videos like this all the time. And seriously, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, because I love seeing where all you guys are tuning in from. And if you made it all the way to the end, you're a real one. Thanks for hanging out with me for these wild stories, and I'll see you in the next video. The therapist who realised her patient was planning something terrible. This story is incredibly dark and therapist named Dr. Rachel Chen, who had been practicing for about 15 years and thought she'd seen everything, but this case challenged everything she believed about patient confidentiality and professional ethics. Dr. Chen had a new patient, a man in his late 20s who we'll call Jason, who came in saying he was dealing with depression and social isolation, pretty standard presenting issues. And in their first few sessions, Jason seemed like a typical patient. He was articulate, intelligent, and seemed genuinely interested in getting better. But over the course of several months, Dr. Chen started noticing disturbing patterns in what Jason was saying. He'd make offhand comments about how society had failed him, how certain groups of people were responsible for his problems, and he had this growing obsession with mass casualty events that he'd tried to frame as academic interest, but felt more personal than that. Dr. Chen tried to explore these thoughts therapeutically, helping Jason examine where these beliefs came from and whether they were serving him, but Jason would deflect or change the subject, and she started to feel like he was using therapy not to get better, but to have an audience for his increasingly dark worldview. Then, in one session, Jason started talking about a detailed fantasy he'd been having. He described it as just thoughts, nothing he'd ever hacked on. But the level of detail was alarming. He talked about locations, methods, timing, and he seemed to be testing Dr. Chen's reaction, watching her face carefully as he spoke. Dr. Chen maintained her professional composure during the session, but inside she was panicking because this sounded like someone who was planning something terrible, and she was faced with this impossible ethical dilemma. Patient confidentiality is sacred in therapy. You can't break it except in very specific circumstances, and one of those circumstances is if you believe the patient is an imminent danger to themselves or others. But Jason hadn't explicitly said he was going to do anything. He'd framed it all as fantasy and thoughts. So did that count as imminent danger, or was Dr. Chen overreacting? After the session, Dr. Chen spent hours reviewing her notes and consulting the ethical guidelines and talking to colleagues without revealing identifying information. And everyone agreed it was a grey area. Jason hadn't made a direct threat. He hadn't named specific targets, and everything he'd said could technically be dismissed as intrusive thoughts that many people have without ever acting on them. But Dr. Chen's gut was screaming at her that this was different, that Jason was escalating, and she noticed he'd started missing sessions, and when he did come, he seemed more agitated and detached from reality, and she felt like she was watching someone spiral towards something catastrophic, and she was powerless to stop it. Dr. Chen made the decision to break confidentiality and report her concerns to the police. She knew it could cost her her license if she was wrong, and it would definitely end her therapeutic relationship with Jason. But she decided she'd rather face professional consequences than live with the knowledge that she could have prevented a tragedy, and chose not to. The police took her report seriously and started investigating Jason. They discovered he'd been stockpiling weapons and ammunition. He'd been researching security measures at various public locations, and he had manifestos saved on his computer outlining his grievances and his plans. And when they brought him in for questioning, he initially denied everything, but eventually admitted he'd been planning an attack at a local shopping mall. He'd picked the date, he'd done therapy sessions, which was one of the most difficult things she'd ever done professionally. She had to violate the trust of the therapeutic relationship and expose private conversations, but she knew it was necessary because lives had been saved. The aftermath was complicated. Some of Dr. Chen's colleagues supported her decision and said she'd done the right thing. Others criticised her for breaking confidentiality over what they saw as insufficient evidence, and there was a whole debate in the professional community about where the line is between protecting patient privacy and protecting public safety. Dr. Chen went through a period of serious self-doubt. She questioned whether she'd overreacted, whether there had been another way to handle it, and she worried that she'd violated the fundamental principle of therapy, which is that patients should feel safe sharing their darkest thoughts without fear of being reported. And if therapists start reporting patients based on their thoughts alone, would anyone ever feel safe being honest in therapy again? But then she'd remember the details of Jason's plans, the maps he'd drawn, the timeline he'd created, and she knew in her gut that he would have gone through with it if he hadn't been stopped, and the guilt she would have carried if she'd done nothing would have been far worse than any professional consequences. Jason ended up pleading guilty and was sentenced to 15 years in prison, and during his sentencing he actually looked at Dr. Chen in the courtroom and said, "Thank you," which shocked everyone. And later, through his lawyer, he sent her a letter explaining that part of him had been hoping someone would stop him, that he'd been sharing those details in therapy as a kind of cry for help, and he was relieved that Dr. Chen had cared enough to take action, even though it cost her the therapeutic relationship. Dr. Chen still practices therapy, but she's much more vigilant about warning signs, and she's become an advocate for clearer guidelines about when therapists should break confidentiality, because the current standards are too vague and put therapists in impossible positions where they have to make judgment calls that could either save lives or ruin them professionally if they're wrong. She also struggles with the knowledge that some potential patients might not seek therapy because they're afraid of being reported, and there's this tension between making therapy a safe space for people to work through dark thoughts and recognizing that some people use therapy as a smokescreen while they plan to do harm. And Dr. Chen doesn't have an answer for how to balance those competing needs. The case haunts her in quiet moments. She thinks about all the things that had to align for Jason to be stopped. If he'd been better at hiding his intentions, if Dr. Chen had been less experienced or more strictly adherent to confidentiality rules, if the police hadn't taken her seriously, any of those factors could have changed the outcome, and dozens of people could have died in a shopping mall on a random Tuesday afternoon. Dr. Chen says the experience fundamentally changed how she practices therapy. She's more direct about discussing the limits of confidentiality up front, and she's more willing to trust her instincts when something feels off. And she tells other therapists that your gut is often picking up on patterns and inconsistencies that your conscious mind hasn't fully processed yet. And when you feel that alarm bell going off, you need to take it seriously, even if you can't fully articulate why. The really disturbing part of this whole story is that Jason wasn't some obviously unstable person. He was educated, came from from a normal family, had a job. On the surface, he looked like someone who was just going through a rough patch, and that's what made him so dangerous. He knew how to present himself as functional while planning something horrific, and if he hadn't been in therapy where he felt compelled to talk about his plans, there would have been no warning at all. Dr. Chen sometimes gives talks at universities and professional conferences about this case, obviously with all identifying details changed, and she emphasizes that prevention is always better than intervention. We need to create a society where people like Jason get help before they reach the point of planning violence, but we also need to acknowledge that some people are going to slip through the cracks, and we need systems in place to catch them before they hurt anyone. The families of potential victims never knew how close they came to tragedy. They were shopping and working and living their normal lives while Jason was planning to attack that mall, and they have no idea that Dr. Chen's decision to break confidentiality saved their lives, and there's something profound about that, about the invisible threads that connect us, and the decisions other people make that shape our fates without us ever knowing. Dr. Chen carries that weight, knowing she saved lives that will never know they were in danger. And while she doesn't regret her decision, she acknowledges it came at a cost. Some of her patients are more guarded now, worried that anything they say might be reported, and Dr. Chen has to work harder to build trust and explain the difference between intrusive thoughts that people have no intention of acting on and genuine planning and intent to harm. The whole experience taught Dr. Chen that therapy isn't just about helping people feel better. Sometimes it's about protecting society from people who can't or won't control their worst impulses, and that's a responsibility that most therapists don't think about when they enter the field, but it's one that can't be ignored. When you're sitting across from someone who's describing detailed plans to hurt people, and you're the only person who knows about it. Jason is still in prison, and according to his lawyer, he's doing well. He's gotten treatment for his mental health issues. He's expressed genuine remorse for what he planned, and he's participating in programs to help him understand and manage the thought patterns that led him down that path. And Dr. Chen hopes that's true, but she also knows that people are complicated, and sometimes redemption is real, and sometimes it's just another manipulation. And she'll probably never know for sure which category Jason falls into. What Dr. Chen does know is that she made the right call in that impossible moment, and even though it was messy and uncomfortable and challenged everything she'd been taught about patient confidentiality, she'd make the same decision again, because at the end of the day, her obligation to protect innocent lives outweighed her obligation to maintain absolute secrecy. And that's a principle she's willing to stake her career on. The delivery driver who kept seeing the same child in different houses. This next story is deeply unsettling, and it comes from a food delivery driver named Marcus, who worked for one of those app-based services, doing deliveries nights and weekends to make extra money while he was in community college. Marcus had a regular route in a suburban area, and he'd deliver to the same neighbourhoods multiple times a week. And he started noticing something really strange. There was this little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, who he kept seeing at different houses, and at first he thought maybe she just had friends all over the neighbourhood, but something about it felt wrong. always looked the same. Same clothes that were kind of dirty and worn out. Same sad expression. And she never seemed excited or happy like a kid visiting a friend's house would be. Instead, she'd just stare at Marcus from windows or doorways with this blank look that made him uncomfortable. Marcus tried to brush it off. Maybe the girl had divorced parents and was going between houses, or maybe she had relatives all over the neighborhood. But then he realized he was seeing her at houses that were really far apart, like across town from each other, and that didn't make sense for any innocent explanation he could think of. One night Marcus delivered food to a house, and the girl answered the door, and Marcus asked her if her parents were home, because he needed an adult to sign for the order. And the girl just shook her head and held out money that was way more than the order cost. And when Marcus tried to explain how change worked, she just turned and walked back into the house, leaving the door open. And Marcus could see inside, and the house was filthy, trash everywhere, and he heard multiple adult voices arguing in another room. Marcus didn't know what to do. He couldn't just walk away because something was clearly wrong, but he also couldn't just walk into someone's house uninvited, so he called out that he was leaving the food on the porch, and he left. But he couldn't stop thinking about that little girl and the situation she was in. Over the next few weeks, Marcus kept track of where he saw the girl, and he realized she was appearing at houses that he knew were involved in drug activity. He'd made enough deliveries in the area to recognize which addresses were sketchy, orders at weird hours, people who looked high when they answered the door, houses that had a lot of traffic at all hours. And this girl was at multiple houses like that. Marcus started taking photos discreetly, just of the houses and the addresses, and he documented dates and times, and he realized he was seeing this girl at 5 or 6 different locations, sometimes multiple times in one night, and the pattern was impossible to ignore. This child was being moved between drug houses for some reason. Marcus called the police and made a report. He explained what he'd been seeing and gave them all his documentation. And the officer who took his report seemed interested, but also skeptical. He said there could be innocent explanations, and without evidence of actual abuse or neglect, they couldn't just raid these houses based on a delivery driver's hunch. But Marcus pushed back. He said this wasn't a hunch, this was a clear pattern of a child being moved between drug houses, and what possible innocent reason could there be for that? And he asked the officer to at least do a welfare check on the girl, and the officer eventually agreed. A few days later, Marcus got a call from a detective asking him to come in and give a full statement. Turns out, when they'd done the welfare check, they'd found a situation that was even worse than Marcus had suspected. The little girl was being used as part of a drug trafficking operation. She'd been kidnapped from another state 2 years earlier and was being moved between houses to avoid detection. And the traffickers used her presence to make the houses look more normal, like family homes instead of drug operations. And they'd also been exploiting her in other ways that the detective wouldn't go into detail about. But Marcus could tell from his expression it was bad. Marcus felt sick. He'd been seeing this girl for months and hadn't reported it right away. And he couldn't help but think about all the nights he'd delivered food to those houses and seen her and done nothing, and the detective assured him that he'd done the right thing by eventually reporting it, and that his documentation had been crucial in building the case. But Marcus still felt guilty for not acting sooner. The trafficking ring was broken up, multiple people were arrested, and the little girl was rescued and reunited with her biological family, who'd been searching for her desperately for 2 years, and Marcus was praised by the police, and he even got a commendation from the city, but he couldn't feel good about any of it because all he could think about was the time he had wasted. Marcus started having nightmares about the girl. In his dreams, he'd see her at windows staring at him, and he'd try to help her, but he couldn't move or speak, and he'd wake up in a panic, thinking about all the other children who might be in similar situations that nobody's noticing. He became hypervigilant during his deliveries, paying attention to anything that seemed off, and he started carrying information about human trafficking hotlines in his car so he could slip it to anyone who seemed like they might need help. And his friend said he was becoming obsessed, but Marcus didn't care. He'd seen what happens when people don't pay attention. The girl's family reached out to Marcus months later through the police to thank him, and they said their daughter was in therapy and doing as well as could be expected, and knowing that Marcus had helped save her was the only thing that let them sleep at night, and they wanted Marcus to know that he'd given them their daughter back and they'd be forever grateful. Marcus met with them once and it was incredibly emotional. The girl was there and she recognized him from the deliveries, and she'd apparently asked about the food delivery man multiple times, wondering if he'd noticed her. And when she found out that Marcus had been the one to report what was happening, she wrote him a letter thanking him for saving her, and Marcus completely broke down reading it. That letter is framed in Marcus's apartment now, and he says it reminds him both of the good he did and the time he wasted before taking action. And he's used his experience to train other delivery drivers and service workers about recognizing signs of trafficking and abuse, because people who go into homes for work are in a unique position to see things that others miss. Marcus eventually quit doing delivery work because it was too triggering for him. Every house became a potential crime scene in his mind, and he couldn't just deliver food anymore without scanning for signs of trouble. And while he's glad he was in a position to help that little girl, he also recognizes that carrying that level of vigilance all the time was destroying his mental health. These days, Marcus works in anti-trafficking advocacy. He speaks at schools and community groups about recognizing the signs and reporting suspicions, and he always tells the story of the little girl in the windows and how months of inaction could have cost her her life, or at least more of her childhood. And he emphasizes that if something feels wrong, it probably is, and it's always better to report and be wrong than to stay silent and let abuse continue. The whole experience fundamentally changed Marcus's view of the world. He used to think bad things happened to other people in other places, but now he knows that horror can be hiding behind any door in any neighborhood, and the only defense against it is people who care enough to pay attention and speak up. And while that's a heavy burden to carry, it's also one that Marcus has accepted because he knows what the alternative looks like, and he never wants to be complicit in that kind of suffering. A married and settled into what seemed like a normal, happy marriage. Paul was an engineer who travelled internationally for work pretty frequently, sometimes for weeks at a time, and Jennifer was used to him being gone and trusted him completely. They'd been married for about 5 years when Jennifer started noticing some financial irregularities, money missing from their joint account, credit card charges from countries Paul had said he wasn't visiting, and when she asked him about it, he always had explanations that sounded reasonable enough: work expenses that hadn't been reimbursed yet, mistaken charges, nothing that seemed like a major red flag on its own. Then one day Jennifer got a friend request on Facebook from a woman she didn't know, and the woman's profile was mostly private, but Jennifer could see enough to notice that this woman had posted photos with Paul, like couple photos, holding hands and kissing, and celebrating what looked like an anniversary. And Jennifer's heart stopped, because these photos were recent, some of them from times when Paul had supposedly been on business trips. Jennifer messaged the woman asking who she was and how she knew Paul, and the woman responded saying she was Paul's wife and asking who Jennifer was. And that's how two women on different continents discovered they were both married to the same man and had been for years. The other woman's name was Sophia, and she lived in the Philippines, and she had been married to Paul for 7 years, which meant he'd married her while he was already married to Jennifer. And when Jennifer and Sophia started comparing notes, they realized Paul had been living completely separate lives with each of them. He'd managed his travel schedule so he could spend months at a time with each wife, and neither of them had suspected anything because he'd always had a plausible work-related reason for being away. Jennifer was devastated and furious. Her entire marriage was a lie, and she immediately confronted Paul, who at first tried to deny it. But when Jennifer showed him the Facebook messages, he broke down and admitted everything. He said he'd fallen in love with Sophia while on a work assignment in the Philippines, and they'd gotten married quickly, and he couldn't bring himself to leave Jennifer, so he just decided to maintain both marriages and convinced himself it could work. Paul tried to justify it by saying he loved both women and didn't want to hurt either of them by choosing, which is possibly the most selfish logic Jennifer had ever heard. And she threw him out immediately and filed for divorce, and she reached out to Sophia to let her know what was happening, and the two women bonded over their shared experience of being deceived by the same man. The legal situation was complicated because Paul's marriage to Sophia wasn't legally recognized in the United States, since he was already married to Jennifer, so technically he'd committed bigamy, which is a crime. And Jennifer pressed charges because she wanted Paul to face consequences for what he'd done, not just to her, but to Sophia, who'd been living as his wife without any legal protections. During the divorce proceedings, Jennifer discovered that Paul had been funneling money to support both households, which explained the financial irregularities she'd noticed, and he'd been using his international work travel as cover for living a double life for almost a decade, and the level of planning and deception involved was staggering. He had separate phones, separate bank accounts. He'd even created elaborate stories about Jennifer and Sophia to people in each country, so no one would suspect he was married to both. Sophia was heartbroken because her entire life with Paul had been built on a She faced social stigma for being in what turned out to be an invalid marriage, and she had a child with Paul, which complicated everything further, because now there was a kid caught in the middle of this mess who deserved support from his father, but whose parents weren't legally married. Jennifer had no children with Paul, thankfully, which made the divorce cleaner, but she still had to process the emotional trauma of discovering that her husband had been living a completely separate life with another woman for years, and every memory of their marriage was now tainted by the knowledge that he'd been with Sophia during times when Jennifer thought he was working, and Jennifer would never know what was real and what was performance. Paul ended up pleading guilty to bigamy and fraud and got a suspended sentence plus probation, and he had to pay restitution to both Jennifer and Sophia for the financial damage he'd caused, but no amount of money could fix the psychological harm he'd done to both women. Jennifer went through intensive therapy to deal with the betrayal and the trust issues, and her therapist helped her understand that what Paul did wasn't a reflection of her worth or her failure as a wife. Some people are just fundamentally dishonest and capable of compartmentalizing their lives in ways that healthy people can't comprehend. Sophia eventually moved on and is raising her son as a single mother, and she and Jennifer stayed in touch for a while, bonded by their shared trauma, but eventually they drifted apart because staying in contact was too painful, a reminder of what Paul had done to both of them. Jennifer is remarried now to someone who is boringly loyal, and she's hyper-vigilant about any signs of deception. She has access to all her current husband's accounts and devices, and she checks them regularly even though her husband has given her no reason to distrust him, and she knows it's not healthy, but she can't help it after what Paul put her through. The whole experience taught Jennifer that you can never truly know another person. Paul had lived a double life for years, and she'd had no idea he'd looked her in the eye and lied about where he was and what he was doing thousands of times. And if he could do that, then anyone could. And that's a terrifying realization that Jennifer struggles with every day. She's become an advocate for legal reforms around bigamy and international marriage fraud because her case exposed how easy it is for people to get away with this, especially when they're travelling internationally for work. And there needs to be better systems in place to verify that people aren't already married before issuing marriage licenses. The most infuriating part for Jennifer is that Paul never seemed to fully understand why what he did was so wrong. He kept talking about how he loved both of them and didn't want to hurt anyone, as if that justified the years of lies and betrayal, and his inability to take real responsibility made it impossible for Jennifer to ever forgive him or find any kind of closure. These days Jennifer is doing better. She's built a new life and learned to trust again, but she says she'll never be as naive as she was before. She'll always have that little voice in the back of her mind questioning things and looking for signs of deception. And while that might protect her from being hurt again, it's also exhausting to live that way. And that's part of the cost of what Paul did. He didn't just destroy their marriage. He damaged Jennifer's ability to fully trust anyone ever again.